Welcome to AP Biology. Today I want to talk to you about cyclic phosphorylation and compare it to what we've been doing this whole time, non-cyclic photophosphorylation. So non-cyclic photophosphorylation is what we've been talking about the whole time. Water is broken by light. Light gives the electron from water some energy, and the electron just moves through in one direction all the way to NADP plus to make NADPH. So that's non-cyclic. It's linear. It's one direction. So just to review that, if you're looking at energy, the energy levels here, a photon pumps an electron from water up to a higher energy level. That electron goes through an electron transport chain. The energy is released along the way because the electrons go to more and more and more electronegative molecules, and that energy is used to make a proton gradient, which then makes ATP. Boom. And then in photosystem 1, the electron that we had all the way from water, right? That electron is boosted by another photon, and that goes through an electron transport chain to make NADPH. So that's non-cyclic. It just goes in one linear direction. You keep needing a fresh supply of electrons that you keep getting from water. Cyclic photophosphorylation is a little bit different. So by the time you get to photosystem 1, right, you start at photosystem 2, by the time you get to photosystem 2, instead of sending the electrons off this way, the electrons go backwards to cytochrome. So here's the reason that happens. In the Calvin cycle actually uses more ATP than it does NADPH. And so the cell actually runs out of this NADP plus. And so you can't keep passing electrons to NADP plus if you don't have any, because there's a whole lot of NADPH around. There's just sort of like it gets backed up a little bit. So if the electrons can't go this way because you don't have any NADP plus, the electrons actually end up going backwards to part of the electron transport chain here. And so when they go around like this molecule still pumps electrons into the thylakoid, still pumps protons into the thylakoid space. So the photosystem is still taking in light. It takes those electrons, bumps them up to a higher energy level, but instead of the electrons going toward NADP+, the electrons go backwards to the cytochrome complex, which pump more protons through. So you still have energy, you still have photons bumping the electrons up to a higher energy level, and those are still going through an electron transport chain. It's just a different electron transport chain. It's that first one instead of the second one. And so the electrons are still going to more and more electronegative molecules, releasing energy. That energy is still pumped through to make a proton gradient. It pumps protons through, right, hydrogen ions, and that still makes ATP. So that is still photophosphorylation, but it goes in a cycle here. You don't need new electrons. So photosystem, photosystem 1 can't pass the electron on to NADP+. So it cycles back to the cytochrome complex and makes more ATP, but no NADP+, or no NADPH. So here's what it looks like. Cyclic photophosphorylation uses only photosystem 1. So you have an electron that came originally from water, right? And it goes through the electron transport chain. But when it gets to here, it can't keep going because you don't have any NADP+. So instead, the electron just cycles back this way to the cytochrome complex. Let me get a color that will show up a little bit more. The electron will cycle back here, and it's going to still go through the electron transport chain here. But instead of going, this way, it's going to go this way, right? And so that the energy is still, the electrons are still being bumped up by light, right? And then they're still going through an electron transport chain where they're losing energy. That energy is used to pump protons through just like it was before. You get a bunch of protons here, you get a proton gradient. That's still used by ATP synthase to make ATP. So you still have photophosphorylation. You're still making ATP, but the electrons go in a circle here. So you don't need new electrons. So if you don't need new electrons, you're not breaking down water and you're not releasing oxygen anymore. And you're not making NADP+. You're just doing this, passing them back around and around and around, which still makes more of a proton gradient, which still makes more ATP. So cyclic photophosphorylation only uses photosystem 2, only uses that second photosystem, photosystem 1, and some of this electron transport chain, the first electron transport chain. No oxygen is released because photosystem 2 isn't breaking down water anymore. So cyclic phosphorylation generates more ATP because the Calvin cycle needs more ATP than it does NADPH. The Calvin cycle uses more ATP than NADPH. So the electron is given energy from a photon of light in photosystem 1, but the electron goes backwards this way to make more ATP instead of making NADPH. So apparently, to make one glucose, you need 18 ATP but only 12 NADPH. So both cyclic and non-cyclic photophosphorylation are always occurring. Some except if you're a purple sulfur bacterium, in which case you only have photosystem 1. So we think cyclic electron flow evolved first. And we also think that it's possible that this cyclic photophosphorylation might protect some cells from light-induced damage. Okay, so in non-cyclic photophosphorylation, just to review, the electron goes through the entire thing in one direction and makes both ATP and NADPH. Oink, oink. That's non-cyclic, right? It's one direction, it's linear. In cyclic photophosphorylation, you get the electron originally from photosystem 2, right, from water being broken, but then it just goes back in a circle and makes more ATP, doesn't break down any extra water, so it's not releasing oxygen, and it's not making NADP+, just making ATP. Coolio. Okay, last thing here is where everything comes from. I wouldn't memorize anything except that the oxygen you breathe comes from water. A couple other fun things you might be interested in. The carbon from carbon dioxide ends up in sugar, which kind of makes sense because there's no other reactant with carbon. The oxygen that's in glucose is coming from the oxygen in carbon dioxide. The hydrogen in glucose is coming from water, which makes sense because there's nothing else with hydrogen there. And then the oxygen from carbon dioxide can go either to sugar or to that other water. So I never really draw the second water in the equation, but there's actually 12 waters to start and 6 waters to end with. But I usually just say 6 here and don't talk about this one because that's like sort of the net thing that happens. Overall 12 minus 6, right, means you start with 6 waters, but you really start with 12 and end with 6. Anyway, the fun fact that I would get out of this is that the oxygen that you breathe comes from water. Of course, that water could have gotten the oxygen originally from carbon dioxide, so it all cycles around, but directly the oxygen that you breathe comes from water, from plants splitting water.